Thank you all again for joining us. We are now going to begin. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Stacy Cianciolo, who is the Behavior Department Supervisor at Monarch School.
Good morning. Thank you so much for attending today. As Lauren shared, we will be discussing positive behavior strategies for challenging behaviors. I know we have a varied audience today, some parents and some professionals with a little bit of a variety of experiences and backgrounds. So we'll begin by just briefly discussing exactly what is a behavior. And to clarify, behaviors are anything that you can see, observe, and measure. So for example, smiling is a behavior, eating is a behavior, reading, writing, running, talking, playing, doing homework, all that you see listed here are examples of behaviors. I list these in particular because sometimes we often mention behaviors include things such as feeling happy or feeling sad or having a tantrum or being upset. And while those are good descriptions of a group of behaviors you may observe, they're technically not behaviors. So for example, throwing a tantrum could, for one child, look like screaming and falling on the floor and kicking their legs. And for another child, it could be crying and throwing materials. For another child, it could be stomping their feet and jumping up and down. So those are the descriptions that we want to talk about. The jumping up and down, the crying, the throwing. Those would be the behaviors to describe instead of using the word tantrum. So as you see listed, smiling is a behavior, feeling happy is not. Eating is a behavior, being hungry is not. Talking is a behavior. Playing is a behavior. Doing homework is a behavior. Learning is not. It's hard to actually see somebody learn. Keep that in mind as we get into challenging behaviors. So what makes a behavior challenging and not just simply a behavior? And that's also important to note. We often say behavior and think of something challenging or thinking of something bad, but there are lots of good behaviors that we all engage in and that our children engage in as well. And we want to keep that in mind as we discuss strategies this morning for changing behaviors. So what are difficult behaviors? Behaviors that are not responsive to traditional instruction or teaching or parenting strategies are considered difficult. So for many children, we can remind them of behaviors we want to see occur. We can remind them to remember their homework. We can remind them to stay in their seat. We can remind them that it's a rule we have to stay in line and not push in front of our friends. Loss of privileges aren't effective for challenging behaviors. So quite often in a school setting, if a child is not in their seat, perhaps they, back when I was in school, would have their name on the board, and today they might move to from green to yellow on the classroom behavior chart. Or perhaps if they push through in line, they have to go to the end of the line. So it was a privilege to be close to the beginning of the line. So loss of privileges aren't working to change the behavior. Explaining why it's wrong might not change the behavior when the behavior is challenging. So explaining it's not nice to push through the line with our friends. It hurts our friends' feelings. Might not make a change in that behavior. Scolding and timeout in the home setting. Quite often as parents, we use that as a strategy of helping our kids understand this is not appropriate, maybe have a timeout, redirect to another activity, and using some positive praise for alternative behaviors. Or, wow, you really stayed in line well today, or you've really done a great job on your homework the past couple of days. Using these strategies, when they don't work to make a change in that negative behavior, we can definitely consider that behavior to be challenging. The outcome of the behavior is severe, such as property destruction, hurting themselves or others, or rude behavior. So for a behavior that has just started to be exhibited, maybe we haven't run through all of these different strategies first. We don't know whether they're going to work or not, but the behavior is pretty severe. Then I would consider that a challenging behavior. And again, when the behavior inhibits learning and social interaction, then it is definitely a challenging behavior. And these are the behaviors that we would warrant further investigation for deciding how to address them and how to make change in those behaviors. I'm sure that many of you here participating today have some behaviors popping to mind as we talk about these different strategies that we have tried. Factors that might add to the challenge. We're focusing our talk today on children on the autism spectrum. However, I want to stress that the tips and techniques that we're discussing and the assessment styles that we're discussing today are applicable to all children, those with special needs and without, and those exhibiting challenging behaviors whether it's a result of a diagnosis or a result of having a difficult time and development, and whether that diagnosis includes autism or not. However, specific to children with autism, quite often communication is a factor that can add to the challenge. And this can be the receptive communication and expressive communication. So it's difficult for the child to talk to us about how they're feeling about this behavior, difficult for them to explain why they're engaging in the behavior. And it's also very difficult for a child with autism to understand when we try to explain the consequences or reason with them. For so many children, the neurotypical children, when they're developing, talking about the reasons for a behavior being unacceptable can really help make a change. So when you take away that ability to reason through the challenge, it really makes it more difficult to make a change. Making a connection between the consequence and the behavior. We're not always certain that connection is being made. And we'll talk more about that as we discuss consequences later on in our talk today. Before we begin attempting to make change in the behavior, there are a few factors we need to know. The first thing we're going to need to find out is what is reinforcing this behavior. It could be something like social attention, escape from a social situation, sensory input that the child is seeking, access to tangible items, or it could be automatic or internal reinforcement, something that's just automatically reinforcing that is not impacted by social attention or escape from social situations. It could also be escape from pain or discomfort. Sometimes our students and our children engage in challenging behaviors because the result is better than another negative sensation they're experiencing. It's also very important to remember the same behavior can occur to produce different consequences. So there may be times when you see what we call the topography of the behavior, what it looks like could happen across different settings, but it could be happening for different reasons. For example, a child may hit their peer when they want their peer to let go of a toy they're currently holding. So they may hit their peer to gain access to a preferred item. They may also hit their peer when they are too close in proximity. So they're wanting more personal space. They're wanting to escape from a social situation. So the hitting or the aggression may be occurring for two different reasons, for access to tangible items and also for escape. So it's really important to pay attention to that and not to assume that the behavior serves only one function. And we should always know what motivates our children and which of those items and activities we have control over. So there may be kids that we're working with who are children of your own at home who have strong motivators such as movies and videos and favorite songs or favorite foods, maybe favorite places they can go. And there might be times when you do have control over their access to those items. And that's important to keep in mind because we'll need to think of some very strong reinforcers for teaching new behaviors later on. But there are also times when they have highly preferred activities, foods, songs that you do not have strict control over. For example, I know my own children who are in school, they may have very favorite songs, and I would love to have some videos that they could watch when they have their homework done, but they also get to hear those songs on the bus or they get to hear those songs in gym class. So it's not something that I have complete control over to manipulate as a reinforcer. So how do we change behaviors? Once we consider the factors we just discussed, the next thing we want to think about are the ABCs of the behavior. The ABCs stand for the antecedent, what happens before the behavior occurs. And the B stands for the behavior, which is what the child does or says. And the consequence is what happens directly after the behavior. We really want to focus on these ABCs. And when we hear the word antecedent, so often people hear antecedent and they think of cause, what caused the behavior, which is not true. Antecedent, again, is just what happens directly before the behavior occurs. It may or may not be the cause of the behavior. So I just want to stress that. And the consequence also may or may not reinforce the behavior. Again, this is just an objective description and an objective observation that we should make of the antecedents, the behavior, and the consequence. And we can make changes in the behavior by manipulating those antecedents and those consequences. So we can change them by changing what happens before and what happens after. So how do we know? How do we know about these antecedents? How do we know about these consequences? How do we find out what is causing the behavior? We want to actively observe the student or child. This is called a direct observation or a direct assessment. Take notes. It's really important to take notes and not just observe and try to remember back. Taking notes will help you track patterns and consistencies in those antecedents and consequences. We want to know what commonly happens before the behavior and what commonly happens after the behavior. We want to look at how do people respond when the behavior occurs. What settings does the behavior usually happen in, and with whom? And are there times when the behavior does not happen? That's an important indicator of, okay, what's going on in this setting, in this environment, and with these particular people when the behavior does not occur. That'll give us a big clue to why the behavior is happening. We also want to think of what has the rest of the day been like. So often, especially in the school setting, a behavior may be occurring, let's say in the afternoon, maybe right after lunch. Every day in the same class, right after lunch, the behavior happens. And we have to consider that maybe it's not what's going on in that class, but what happens at lunch, what happens earlier in the morning. We all know there are times in our day when we might be a little more short-tempered at work because we had a bad morning at home. Or we may get home from work and be a little more short-tempered with our families because of what happened that day at work, and we're just so tired from a stressful day. So it's important to remember that what's happened in a previous setting can impact the behavior in the current setting. And you'll see the last point on this slide is to consider conducting a functional behavior assessment and developing a behavior intervention plan. Now, what we're discussing today and how to make changes in behaviors is a modified or simplified FBA, and developing a simplified or an informal behavior intervention plan. However, if the behavior continues to be challenging and is severe, it may warrant a more in-depth look, a more in-depth functional behavior assessment. And we will talk later this morning about what that would look like. This slide is a sample ABC data sheet. I'm sure many of you have used these before, but this is a sample in case you have not of what you would track. So you see that you want to always record the date, the time, and the person who was involved. And I apologize, it looks like some of the letters there have not stayed where they shouldn't be in line. But you want to check the date, time, and the person, and the settings. That could be in the home, it could be in the community, in the school, and I would be more specific even of saying where in the community, which room in the home, which classroom in the school. Then you track the antecedent, the behavior, the consequence, and also the child's response. It's important to see the child's response to the consequence. Did the behavior become more intense? Did the behavior lessen? Did it stop altogether after the consequence was administered? Other things we need to consider. So the ABCs will tell us so much about patterns and perhaps what's maintaining the function and what's motivating this behavior. But other things we need to consider is the child's mood, the child's preferences, sensory needs, communication abilities, physical health, and stress. So often we forget those last two, physical health and stress. I mean, just imagine how much different your behaviors are when you're not feeling well. If you have a terrible headache or a terrible toothache, or if you're coming down with the flu, we definitely do not act the same as we would act if we're feeling wonderful. And stress as well. Even if we don't have something stressful happening right there in that moment, you know, the student we're thinking of could be at recess, which is a leisure time and something they really enjoy, but the day has been stressful. There have been new tasks introduced. There's been a lot going on at home. Maybe they've just recently had some major changes in the home setting, and with a move, or providers have changed. Stress impacts all of us, whether we can talk about it or not, whether we are conscious of it or not. We all feel stress, and it impacts our behaviors. So when a behavior is just beginning to be exhibited, a challenging behavior, when it's become more intense, I would definitely consider some of these elements as well. And the communication abilities. One question I always ask when looking at a challenging behavior is, what is this child trying to tell us? All behaviors are a function of communication. So what do we do with what we learn? Once we've looked at those ABCs, we've thought about all of the potential stressors and potential medical challenges or discomforts, thought about what the child is trying to tell us, we want to start looking at the common factors and consistencies. We want to figure out, well, what can we control? We might not be able to change everything, even if we find a pattern, but what can we change with the environmental factors, the reinforcement, the schedules of the day? What are the alternatives? What would we like to see this child be doing instead? So to use the example of minor aggression again, instead of hitting the peer, to get access to the toy, what would we rather that child do? And then we want to make a plan using some positive behavior supports. And I strongly recommend when you're making those plans to write it down, make sure there's some consistency. Write it down for everybody who will be addressing this behavior to make sure they're on the same page. I mentioned using positive behavior support. So what are they exactly? There are three different categories. There's positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Don't let that word negative confuse you. It is still reinforcing, which is a good thing. And there's proactive strategies. To further explain the difference between positive and negative reinforcement, we first have to understand what is reinforcement. Reinforcement is a stimulus that occurs after a behavior that will increase the rate of that behavior occurring. We can have positive reinforcement for a challenging behavior, which would be a consequence that follows that challenging behavior that will make that behavior happen more often. And we can have it for positive behaviors. So that would be, again, a consequence for a good behavior, positive behavior, that will make that positive behavior happen again more often. Negative reinforcement is the opposite. It's still reinforcement, so it's going to make that behavior occur more often, but you've taken something away in order to make it occur. So let's look at an example. For positive reinforcement, let's say we have a student in a school setting who is really working well on a challenging assignment. And this is not always the case for the student. So quite often challenging assignments cause the student to put their head down, throw the materials to the floor, maybe tear them in two, and they can become very oppositional when the work is challenging. And so if the student is now exhibiting a more positive behavior, they're working well through it, then you let them listen to some music while they do the last page. Wow, I love how hard you're working on this. I know this is difficult for you. Here, I have your favorite song waiting for you. Why don't we listen to it while we finish working? That would be an example of positive reinforcement. You are giving a consequence, you're giving a stimulus to hopefully encourage that positive behavior to happen more often. To take the same example, the student has always had a hard time on challenging work, often tears up their materials and throws them on the floor, but now is exhibiting some really good working skills, sitting down and really trying to tackle this challenging task. You praise them again. Well, I love how hard you're working. You're really doing a great job on this assignment. You're doing so great, we can skip the last page. Now you have taken away a stimulus in order to reinforce that positive work behavior. So again, reinforcement is any consequence that's going to increase the rate of the behavior. Positive, you're giving a consequence. Negative, you're taking it away. We can also input some proactive strategies like visual supports to help organize the student's day or child's day, to help the children communicate, and to clarify instruction. And I have some more examples of these visual supports closer to the end of the presentation today. Schedules are huge. I think often of how drastically different my day would be and how more intense my stress would be if I didn't have a schedule. For example, this presentation today, if all you knew was that it began at 10 o'clock, but you had no idea what time to expect it to end, I don't think you'd be as comfortable listening right now as you are. Hopefully you're all comfortable as you're listening right now. But if you weren't sure if it was over at 11, 12, 1, how would you plan the rest of your workday? Your lunch, the next activity you have on your schedule, you wouldn't be sure if you could even make it to that next meeting. I myself know that I have an 11:30 meeting. So if I wasn't sure what time this would be ending, I would be feeling a little anxious about that 11:30 meeting myself. So schedules are very important for all of our children. For those of you who work with children with strong communication skills, I'm sure they ask you quite often, what's next, or how much do I need to do, or when will this be over? So we always need to consider for students who cannot ask those questions, are we providing that information for them? Lastly, proactive strategies can include environmental changes. So this might not be a direct antecedent or direct consequence, but in our ABC chart, perhaps we noticed some common consistencies in the setting, and we need to make changes there. Let's look at this in a little more detail. As a highlight, first of all, we can change the environment, we can change the antecedent, we can change the consequence, we can manipulate the reinforcement, and we can teach replacement behavior. And now we're going to look at each of these steps individually. So changing the environment. If we are concerned that the child might be overstimulated, then we need to reduce the stimulation. This is always usually a pretty simple change to make that can make a drastic change in the challenging behaviors. So it could be sights, the sounds, the crowd. I would be interested in knowing how many of you listening today can identify with that. There are certain settings you're in that just automatically increase your stress level and may have a direct impact on your behavior. So for example, if a child does not like a crowd and you're in a crowded setting, you may see the challenging behavior occur more often. There may be some certain sounds in the environment or lights or other visual stimuli that impact the rate of the challenging behavior. If there's a lack of structure, if you happen to notice that when assessing the behavior, that perhaps the behaviors occur more often when it's during downtime or transition time or leisure time, those are usually times of the day that have less structure. The home setting by nature is less structured than the school setting. So if you're seeing a behavior that is more challenging at home during free time, perhaps there needs to be more structure. Or mealtime. Making it more fun. This is always my favorite way to address the behavior. It never hurts to make it more fun. So if you notice there's a task the child simply doesn't like, but it needs to happen anyways, then you can make it more fun. One of my favorite phrases to use with my own kids at home is, it doesn't have to be fun, it just has to be done, but that doesn't always work. Sometimes it does have to be fun. Sometimes we have to take a challenging activity and make it more enjoyable. We call that pairing a preferred activity with a non-preferred activity, and it rubs off every time. Often you'll notice the same person is involved when you're tracking in the ABC data, that it happens to be one particular person in the home setting or one particular person in the school setting that it seems the behavior is more likely to happen with. I encourage you to try not to take that personal, but try to remove that person and see if it makes a difference. Sometimes we just have to change the face, and it can make a huge difference in that child's day. I know that's often easier said than done because sometimes there is only one parent at home for parts of the day. Sometimes the student needs to be with that particular teacher or therapist. But if you can make a change temporarily and then teach tolerance, fade it back in, teach that child to maybe enjoy time with that particular instructor or parent more, then in the long run, you'll see a better success. I think that can be a challenge for many of us professionally and as parents. When we think of the change we could make, we think of how difficult it would be to sustain that change or how impractical that change could be. So I encourage you, if you think the change can impact the challenging behavior, remember that it doesn't have to be a permanent change. You can change it and then teach tolerance. The same with the antecedent. Sometimes it's a certain statement that is made that the child doesn't want to hear, like all done. I have, again, to use a personal example, I have a toddler at home, and when I start to count down, I thought it would be great. Let's structure transitions. We'll count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Bath time is all done. Bubbles are all done. The airplane has to go to bed. Now, when I say 5, 4, the tantrum begins. So I have learned that sometimes that statement isn't so productive, and I need to make a change in that statement. So you can change a statement to a question. Instead of counting down to say we're all done, I can say, what do you want to do next? And offer a choice. The same can be true in the reverse. Sometimes we ask a question that we really didn't want an answer to. Are you ready to brush your teeth? No. And then we see a protest behavior. So we can change that to a statement of, it's time to brush your teeth. Which toothbrush do you want to use? Make it visual, have a visual schedule, help them understand what to expect and what's coming next. And use the visual as the instruction itself, maybe a picture of it's time to brush teeth. Sometimes taking away the verbal instruction and switching it out with a visual cue can really take away that battle and make it a little more clear and make it a little bit of a smoother transition. Make it concrete. Make sure your words mean exactly what you expect for that antecedent, especially if it's a type of instruction. If you want the child to sit in their chair, try saying sit in your chair instead of it's time to take a seat now. So making it concrete, making it visual, manipulating questions and statements, and offering more choices. We all like that autonomy, that ability to make a choice, the ability to make our preferences known. So I encourage looking at the times of day that you can offer choices and doing it as much as you can. Okay, it's time for math. Which math should we start with? Here's what we have to get done today. You put it in order. What do you want to work for? Which color crayon would you like to use? Do you want to use a pencil or a marker? If you have a child who really enjoys asserting their opinion, then offer those choices every chance you get. If there's a certain phrase you realize in your assessment is a trigger, let's avoid it. Sometimes that phrase can be no, sometimes it can be all done. Sometimes it can be a word that you really need to say and it's difficult to eliminate from your vocabulary. Again, it doesn't have to be a permanent change, but you can eliminate it temporarily, reduce the rate of the behavior, and then teach tolerance slowly. Changing the consequence. The first idea that comes to mind for many people when we talk about changing the consequence of the behavior is to remove the reinforcement. So if we realize through our assessments that the challenging behavior is occurring in order to gain attention. So perhaps a student is running out of the classroom or running out of the house and laughing and looking over their shoulder and waiting for you to follow. We know that they're seeking attention. If they ran out of the house and were hoping to not have you follow them by they weren't looking at you, they were running super fast, there's no laughter, they're trying to hide, we might think perhaps that running behavior is for escape. But a big indicator that a behavior is attention seeking is when they're looking at your reaction, wanting to see what you're going to do next. So the idea might be, well, let's remove the reinforcer. Let's ignore the behavior. I want to caution you about letting that be your only intervention. Removing the reinforcement will first and foremost increase the rate of the behavior. It always gets worse before it gets better. So for example, if the child is running out of the house or running out of the classroom and looking after you to see if you're going to chase them and you don't, they're going to find another way to get your attention. So maybe they'll run farther. Maybe they'll run and scream loud because you have to chase them then to quiet them down. Usually it does get worse. My favorite example of this is a pop machine. We all have used a pop machine before, and if you imagine a time when perhaps you use the same one every day, let's pretend that you're at work and your favorite afternoon break time is to go get a can of Diet Coke. So you put in your 50 cents or you put in your dollar, that's your behavior. And then out comes the Coke, which is the reinforcement or the consequence. Now, if the reinforcement is removed, you put in your dollar and one day the pop doesn't come out. Typically, we don't simply say, oh, okay, I guess I don't get a Coke today and go back to our desk. Instead, many of us would shake the pop machine or maybe give it a little kick. We might tap on the button pretty hard and see what happens. And if that works and we get the pop, then the next time will be even quicker to give it a little kick, a little hit, a little shake. So we all are prone to this. So we have to be very careful when we choose to remove reinforcement of the challenging behavior to expect that challenging behavior to get worse. I will never forget the first time I thought, fresh out of college, to try this approach and didn't think about what else I should be doing. So I had a young student who liked to see my reaction when she tugged on my hair. And I thought, you know what, this is getting to be kind of in the way of our math instruction. I am going to ignore it when she pulls on my hair. So I did. So she pulled harder, a lot harder, and I could not ignore it. And so the next day, sure enough, she just pulled as hard as she could because she knew if she jumped straight to that intensity, I would be sure to react. So again, removing the reinforcement for the challenging behavior can be quite effective, but we want to implement some other strategies as well. For example, we want to provide an alternate consequence that might deter the behavior. We could try a loss of a privilege, a removal from the preferred environment. Again, this depends on the functioning level of the child, but perhaps if the work isn't done to the level that it should be, we can add in some more responsibilities. This is another option instead of just removing the reinforcement that we can do to change the behavior. We can also manipulate the reinforcement a little bit. So a consequence, remember, is only reinforcing if it increases the rate of behavior. And the reinforcement is personal. It's different for everyone. What's reinforcing for me is surely not the same as it is for you. Some of us are very highly reinforced by chocolate, and some of us more by pretzels and chips. Some of us might really enjoy favorite music. Other people may prefer to have some free time to go take a walk. Reinforcement needs to be contingent upon the behaviors, immediate. It needs to be enough to make a difference. And we have to be careful about satiation. So contingent upon the behaviors, what does that mean? It means the behavior needs to the reinforcement needs to happen because the behavior happened. We see this a lot with tokens, for example, in a token economy. A student receives a token because they are working well. They're completing the task, they're completing the assignment. But do they know why they're getting that token? We want to make sure that we give the token because, wow, you just finished that whole page. Here's your token. Oh, you are sitting in your seat. Great job. Here's your token. So they get the token right when the behavior occurs, and they know that that's why they're getting it. It needs to be immediate. It has to happen as soon as possible after the behavior occurs, especially for lower functioning or lower communicating students. Avoiding satiation means we want to make sure we're not giving too much of a good thing. You may have a student who loves a certain video to watch on YouTube. We all have songs that we love and videos that we love to see and hear. But once you've seen them 100 times, you've probably had about enough. I don't know if any of you have kids who are into the newest movie Frozen. I know I loved all the music from Frozen for the first maybe month or two that it was out. Now that I have to hear it every day, many, many times a day, it's becoming much less reinforcing to me. We can all think of a time when our favorite song played on the radio and we'd be so excited to hear it. And then after a couple of weeks, and it was playing all the time, we didn't like it quite as much. We start changing the station. And then 5 years later, it pops on the radio and it's way more reinforcing again. The same holds true for the reinforcement we're using in the classroom setting and in the home setting. We want to use enough of it. We want it to be immediate following the behavior, so we are sure that that connection is being made, that the consequence is connected to that behavior and is contingent upon it. But we want to make sure we aren't satiated and we're not getting too much. If you're using edibles as a reinforcer, which there's a lot of controversy around that, but there also is a lot of evidence that it's very effective. And if any child you ask, if you ask many children, do you want to work for a piece of chocolate? Many of them are thrilled to do so. We just want to be careful, of course, with health concerns and make sure it's an ethical choice to make. But we want to make sure also that the children are not satiated in that moment. So using M&Ms, for example, as a reinforcer might work really well late in the afternoon, might not work so well directly after lunch. Using juice as a reinforcer might work really well in the middle of the morning, but maybe not right after breakfast when they just had a whole glass of juice anyhow. So satiation is very important to keep an eye on. The density, when I mentioned it has to be dense enough to make a difference, going back to the M&M, some kids, an M&M once in a while is fantastic to them. Others might get really frustrated because they know there's a whole bag of M&Ms. There's not just one. So you have to be aware of how much you should give for that particular child. If we look at adults, to put it into an example we may understand better, we often work at our jobs for a monetary reinforcer. So we want to make sure that we know we're getting paid for the job that we're doing. If money magically appeared in your bank account, you'd be thrilled that it was there, I'm sure. But if you didn't know who it was coming from, that it was from your employer and that you got it because you went to work, then that money might not motivate you to go to work. It would just be great to have. If you only got paid once every 6 months, even if it's the same amount you're getting now, it'd be a lot harder to wait to get that money than it would be to wait 2 weeks. Wouldn't be practical. It would also be difficult. So the immediacy would not be sufficient to sustain your behavior of going to work. Avoiding the satiation, that might not apply in this situation. I'm kidding. Of course it would apply. If you were so wealthy that money didn't matter to you, then a monetary reward would not motivate you to go to work. You may still go because you love your job and there are other reinforcers out there. But if you didn't need that income, then you might not be motivated by it to show up every day. And the density. Of course, we all know that the job that we hold has to have enough of that monetary value, enough monetary reinforcement to make it make sense to us. So these elements are not just for the students that we work with or our children in the home setting. They apply to all people everywhere of how we're going to continue to increase our behaviors. But it's important to remember when we're looking at how we can increase the rate of a positive behavior and decrease the rate of a challenging behavior. As I just mentioned, increasing the rate of a positive behavior, this is a great way to eliminate a challenging one. So when I mentioned earlier and cautioned you against simply removing the reinforcer, this is what I was referring to. We don't just want to extinguish a behavior, we want to replace it. And it's best if we can do this simultaneously. So if we can remove the reinforcement for that attention-seeking behavior, but teach a new way to gain attention and apply all of those principles of reinforcement to that new behavior while removing them from the old behavior, we should see some pretty quick success. So we want to consider, what should the child do instead? What would we like to see them do to gain that same consequence, that same reinforcer? How can we help them access the reinforcement they're looking for? Whether it is escape, whether it's access to a tangible item, whether it's attention, or whether it is to reduce discomfort or an uncomfortable sensory situation, or to gain access to more of a sensory input that they're looking for. We want to ask ourselves, is it a skill they already have? So ideally, for example, we'd like them to ask for that toy instead of hitting their peer. Instead of aggressing, we want them to use their words. Is that a skill they have? Do they know how to say, I want a turn, please? If it's not, then how could we teach it? How will we reinforce it? This is especially important for escape behaviors. I think sometimes that can be one of the most challenging to apply this to. For example, if you're working with a child, I know I've had this situation happen recently, working with a child who was engaging in disruptive screaming, pretty intense foot stomping, and a long duration of crying because of wanting to escape an instructional setting. So what we taught this child to do was to ask to leave that setting. So at first it sounded counterproductive. They wanted out of the schoolwork. So we are going to let her out of the schoolwork by simply asking her to say, no thanks, or I want a break. And how do we reinforce it? Well, we let that break happen every single time she asked. So every time she said, I want a break, we said, sure. Now you can see how this could become a problem. If she's asking for a break every 10 minutes, then she's not going to spend much time actually participating in the classroom setting. That was okay for a while. It was okay because it stopped the challenging behavior, and that was the goal. The goal was to eliminate the screaming, foot stomping, major disruptive behavior and replace it with an appropriate way to ask for a break. And in the meantime, if we think back to some of the antecedent strategies we can put into place, changing the environment, we worked really hard at making some of those non-preferred work sessions much more preferred and more fun. So we tried to look at patterns and settings when the protest behavior was occurring, of when the replacement behavior was really being used. Can I have a break? I don't want to do this. We looked at those times and we changed them. We made them much more enjoyable and much more fun. And we saw the use of that replacement behavior go down a little bit. We also then, as we were reinforcing it continuously, we started to thin it a little bit, that schedule, and reinforced it more intermittently. So we'd say, sure, you can have a break. Or we'd say, not now, but in 5 minutes, you can have a break. So we taught the replacement behavior. We couldn't really extinguish the reinforcement. It was hard to ignore the tantruming. It was hard to continue working through the screaming. But we did make sure that it was clear the work can go away when you ask appropriately, and the work stays present when you don't, to an attempt to extinguish that behavior. So you want to identify as a team, how will you reinforce it? And how can it be even better than the reinforcement they were getting for the challenging behavior? So again, in this example, not only did she get a break, but she got a break with something she liked. She got to have access to a preferred activity and get out of the non-preferred activity. We did that to make sure that we would see the use of that behavior happen more often than the tantrum. If both behaviors work for her, then we have no assurance that the replacement behavior will be the one that she chooses to use. So that is just an example of how you can teach a replacement behavior and identify the reinforcement and how you're going to change that reinforcement over time. If we had more time this morning, and especially if we were in small groups and face-to-face, this is an exercise that I would love to be able to run through. And I encourage you, if you are together in a group today, or even if you're on your own, to look at these steps and practice this on your own. These are the steps we'd want to run through on a summary of what we've talked about so far. You first want to identify the behavior, and you really want to identify objectively. Describe what it looks like, describe the intensity, describe how long it happens, and then you want to hypothesize the function of the behavior after completing those observations, ABC charts, and so on and so forth. You want to list the other factors that might be impacting the behavior, the communication challenges, the general well-being, stress, the environment. You want to think of an acceptable replacement behavior. What do you want them to do instead? You want to consider, what can you change? How can you change the environment? How can you change the antecedents? How can you change the consequences? How will you teach the replacement behavior and determine the reinforcement? And I would write all of this down, especially the last few steps. What are you changing? What are you teaching? How will you reinforce it? Have all of that in writing so everybody involved can be on the exact same page. I want to make sure I'm saving some time for some questions at the end, but there's a few areas we talked about that I would like to highlight in just a little bit more detail. I mentioned the need to do an FBA, and again, what we've been talking about is a simplified version of an FBA. So what's missing? What makes it less simplified? A functional behavior assessment ideally would be conducted by a behavior specialist. Of course, I'm biased on what that term means, and I know it means something different in many settings, but in the best case scenario, you would have a board certified behavior analyst or psychologist or the equivalent thereof who has sufficient training in conducting FBAs. I recognize in many settings that is difficult to find. So somebody who has extensive training in a functional behavior assessment would be the next ideal. Your school psychologist, if you're in a school setting, is a great resource for conducting an FBA or counselor with that formal training. There are also a lot of wonderful resources out there that can walk you through those steps, but ideally you would find the right qualification to do these. The assessments would include an educational, behavioral, and medical history, so a thorough record review. An interview of parents and caregivers and teachers, if this is being conducted in the school setting. There are some functional assessment interviews for teachers and functional assessment interviews for parents that can be completed. You want some direct measures and systematic observations that include time samplings, direct ABC measurements, and also some functional assessment screening measures, such as the FAST, the Functional Assessment Screening Tool. One that's not listed on here is the MAS, the Motivation Assessment Scale. The ABC data should be analyzed. Often we do an antecedent analysis and a consequential analysis that determines some correlational coefficients to really tease out those common categories of antecedents and consequences. And also establishing a baseline so that you have something to measure against to see if your intervention is effective. And then you select the best treatment options as we discussed here today. The behavior plan then is based on the results of the FBA. So once you have the information, which is the assessment, you need to develop a plan. And it often is also written by the behavior specialist and should always include, first and foremost, proactive strategies. I caution anybody jumping just to reactive strategies. We want to make sure we're being proactive, that we're making whatever positive changes we can in the environment and in the antecedents to help prevent the behavior from occurring in the first place. And of course, we need consistent reactive strategies for if and when the behavior does occur. Again, we want to identify and describe those replacement behaviors with a plan to teach it. For those of you working in special education, that's very similar to creating an IEP goal. It needs to have all of the same elements: what you're going to teach, the criteria for mastery, and the steps to teach it, those objectives you would see in the goal. You want to identify the reinforcement schedule for that replacement behavior, and oftentimes identify how you're going to thin that reinforcement schedule back out. An intense reinforcement schedule is difficult to maintain for a long period of time. And you also want to avoid that satiation. You want, once the behavior is learned and is being exhibited, you want to thin out that schedule, make it happen less often, so you have access to that reinforcers for something else. Make sure you have some available reinforcement to teach other behaviors that might need to be addressed. And you want to have a consistent data collection method that monitors success of the behavior plan. The behavior specialist should provide training for anybody who's going to be conducting the plan. So anybody's going to be implementing it. The teachers, the therapists, the parents, caregivers need to have formal training in exactly how to implement the different strategies outlined in the plan. Monitoring the behavior plan, this should be done at least weekly or bi-weekly by the behavior specialist. Gathering the data that's collected by those who are implementing it and graphing that data to make sure that change is occurring. If change isn't occurring within a few weeks, then the plan isn't effective. Maybe we have the wrong function, or maybe not enough of one of the elements we tried to change. So we need to tweak that. And all changes should be documented so everybody who's involved, again, can be consistent. Observations should be conducted too to make sure that the implementation is being done accurately and consistently, and there's fidelity across settings, making sure everybody's doing the same thing. Switching gears just a little bit, I would have loved to have a little more time to go into more depth on visual supports. You know, at the Monarch Center for Autism, we work so much on incorporating visual supports into our day, especially in regards to behaviors, just because of how effective they could be. And we break them into different categories, making sure we're using them across different settings and structures. So we have visuals for instruction, which we talked about earlier today. Just to provide you with some more examples, I think these are such valuable tools. Using social stories for instruction in regards to behavior plans, it's good to use a social story to explain when you're going to be putting a behavior on extinction and expecting a replacement behavior instead. Even something so simple as, to stay with the same example of aggressing towards a peer. Sometimes I want to play with my friend's toy. I sometimes hit my friend to get the toy. Hitting is not okay. When I hit my friend, I will not get the toy. When I use my words and I say, can I have a turn? I can have a turn with the toy. Something you can simplify that or make it more complex depending on the language ability of the student. But explaining, hey, we understand what you're doing and we're not going to reinforce it, but here's an alternative. Here's something you can do instead, is great to do through a social story. A video model, maybe make a video of another peer nicely asking for the toy and getting access to the toy to help that child see, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. We all know how much more attentive our students can be to screen media than to our explanations. We know how the video, whether it's a screen or a tablet, any sort of video that we can produce can really grab the attention of the student and help them understand this is where you should be focused. This is what you should see and listen to right now. So explaining the expectations through a video model can be really beneficial. Also, using static images and examples and visual presentations of the information can just be so useful when you're trying to teach that new skill. Visuals for organization, and I apologize, I can see on the slide here that my acronyms are flip-flopped. Obviously, the visuals for the visual organization mode is the VOM, and the VEM would be a visual expressive mode. But the most important thing to know is what that all means. So visuals for organization, using schedules, timers. I think this is the area most of us are very strong in. We provide those visual schedules so we know what to expect, timers so we know how long an activity is going to last. And visuals for expression, making sure all of our kids have a voice. Even students who are verbal, making sure they're able to pull together the ideas and the information through the use of topic boards or having some icons or using a communication device. And if you'd like more information, there is a link at the end of the slide where you can get a lot more detail on these different types of visuals that you can be using. And I encourage you to look at these for general instruction and teaching skills and organizing both the home and school setting, but they're especially useful in, when addressing behaviors as well. I know we're nearing the end of our time, so I thought I'd leave a little bit of time for questions. And it looks like I have one now. Referring to the example that I used about the girl who was trying to escape behaviors, she was a preschool age student. And how long did it take for her to do work without tantrums? Only a couple weeks. It was really short. I think just about as soon, and I think continually over time, this plan has been in effect for quite a few months. And over time, we've identified other situations where we can make things a little bit more fun. But it didn't take too long for the idea to settle in. And I also see a question about accessing a file of the slideshow due to missing the first few panels. And yes, that will be uploaded in about a week, I believe. If anybody has other questions, feel free to chat them in now.
We're also going to unmute everyone.
So you can ask questions as well if you have them.
We're looking to help you guys and provide you with all the information that we possibly give you. I know Washington.
I see another question here. What would work for a second grader for math work? I would love a little more detail about that question. For helping them enjoy math work a little more, not protest math work, or just make better progress. Oh, yes, tantrums in class. Well, I think the first thing you have to do is figure out why. Why is he having the tantrum? Is it because he's trying to escape the work? Is it the actual work itself that is triggering the behavior, or is it the environment? I would recommend trying the same exact work in a different setting so you can find out if it's the work or the environment. He thinks it's too hard and hates math is the answer I'm seeing here. So if that's the case, and he does the same at home, so we know it's happening across settings, if that's the case, you can really try some pairing procedures like we talked about, of trying to make the math more fun. Is there a way to get the same content done in a way that he enjoys? Also, there are times when we can use something called behavior momentum. So if there's any type of math or work with numbers that he can do that he doesn't find too hard, make sure you start with that and provide lots of positive reinforcement. Maybe set up some sort of token economy for completing super simple math activities and slowly reintegrating the more challenging math activities. Sometimes that helps if you can do that for a little while. But really, this pairing procedures can be really beneficial of making access to, instead of withholding reinforcement until math is done, of making reinforcement accessible during math, but not accessible if he isn't participating. So, for example, if it's possible to have a favorite snack while you're doing math, but that even like a lollipop or candy if they really love that sort of thing, or having a peer hang out with you during math, but only if you're participating, only if you're really trying to get the work done. Sometimes, depending on second grade, self-monitoring, if you want to look into some self-monitoring techniques, can be really useful. So helping a student keep track of his own behaviors, of really looking at how am I doing? And you can do that on a time schedule. So for example, I have a first grader I've worked with who didn't like his writing assignments. He didn't like to do he liked to read, but not to write about the stories afterwards. So we set up a 2-minute self-monitoring system where a timer went off every 2 minutes and he had to fill in a circle of I was working hard on my writing or I was not working hard. And then at the end, he got to count how many circles he had about working hard. And he got to exchange those circles, or basically tokens. Once he had enough added up, he could exchange them for a reward. So it was a token economy, but it was self-monitoring. So he really got to look at it and took the battle out. It took out the instructor saying, you need to focus, you need to keep going, because we recognized not only did he not like it and was he trying to escape, it was a dual function of escape and attention seeking. He would rather have had some negative attention than do the work. So sometimes self-monitoring can be really useful for that as well. So hopefully some of those strategies you can explore a little bit more of. When will this PowerPoint be available to download and print? It will be, to get some other people on board here, it will be available within the next couple of days. And will audio presentation be available for those who attended?
We are attempting that. So we've attempted to record this as Stacy has presented. And if we are successful, then we will also upload an audio presentation and send you a link to that as well.
And I love this next question. Is what I talked about today the same as ABA, or is that just one type of behavior intervention? You know, everything I talked about today comes from applied behavior analysis. Applied behavior analysis is a discipline of psychology that studies the way our environment impacts our behaviors and how our behaviors impact our environment. So everything we talked about today comes from the field of applied behavior analysis. There are a lot of intervention methods that come from the field of ABA for teaching. There are things like verbal behavior, discrete trial, direct instruction, precision teaching, incidental teaching. There are so many wonderful interventions that come out of ABA. And assessing challenging behaviors to make behavior change procedures is something that also comes from applied behavior analysis. And from another individual, we have a question. What do you do when a motivator cannot be found? Somebody who will not leave his closet for basic life functions, using violence in order to avoid tasks. That is a very challenging behavior, one that I think could take a good bit of time to go into. For the first part of the question, what do you do when a motivator cannot be found? You get really creative. So there's always something that can be motivating. And the way I figure that out often is by looking at when is the behavior not occurring. If this child was completely left alone, what would they do with their time? And from there, you want to try to tease out some similar situations and very creative situations that can be motivating. There are also some really great preference assessments. There's a preference assessment app, and it's simply called Preference Assessment App, that is accessible on iPads. I'm not sure about other tablets or Android tablets, but I know it's accessible on the iPad, that will walk you through how to do a preference assessment. And you can just experiment with things that you know the child likes and things that maybe they like, things you have no idea if they're interested in, and it walks you through how to tease out what is interesting to the child, and then you can try to use those preferences as motivators. As for the last part of that question, the really, really challenging, not leaving the closet for basic life functions, using violence, I encourage you to do a thorough FBA and have multiple professionals involved. I would look at that medical side. I would look at the mental health side and the behavioral side. So pulling together your resources, mental health, physical, like medical and behavioral and communication, and do a thorough analysis of what's going on for that kiddo. That sounds very challenging. How important is it to have an educational setting with a BCBA or BA on staff? So for those of you who may not be aware, BCBA stands for Board Certified Behavior Analyst. There are behavior analysts by training, or behavior specialists, I would call them, by training, who do not have that certification. It is a master's level, postmaster's certification. I think it's very important. I'm biased because I am a BCBA, so of course I think it's something important and valuable to have. But I do think that when you're working with severe behaviors, it's extremely important. Working with minimally or moderately challenging behaviors, I think some good training can be very useful. But if you have some severe behaviors, if you really need to do thorough FBAs and detailed behavior plans, I strongly encourage that level of experience to be involved. Are there any other questions we have? If not, I thank you all so much for listening today. Oh, there is one more. I'm so sorry. How about the reinforcement for not tantruming in class? Should he have that happen first and foremost? Or because his work is so important to grades, is that not feasible to give him the break? That's a really great question. As working with a lot of teachers in my current position, when I first recommend giving a break from class, of course, that's challenging for the teacher because they want to be able to teach. But that can be so beneficial. When a student realizes, oh, there's a better way to get what I'm asking for, when they start to feel confident that asking appropriately will get them a break, then you can wean them off of needing breaks so often. Sometimes kids ask for breaks so frequently because they're not certain that they're going to be able to have it. And once they feel comfortable, then you can, again, thin that reinforcement schedule, make it so that the break, you can show them, wow, you're doing such a great job. You get 5 breaks today. You can use them anytime you want. And then later it's 3 and it's 2 and it's 1 until you're at a level that you think is appropriate. And should they have reinforcement for not tantruming? That's a great idea. We've always heard that phrase, catch them being good. Of course, use some reinforcement and apply it when the appropriate behaviors are being demonstrated. And if there are any other questions, please let me know. I have another question. Somebody who's a parent who would like help in finding residential options. We could redirect you to the contact information on the last slide, the Monarch Center for Autism. There's website, my email is here, and multiple telephone numbers you could access. And we'd be happy to help connect you with those resources. How do you find the correct school? What a wonderful question. That's difficult because the correct is different for everybody. What I recommend to parents first and foremost is to write down what would that be for you? How do you define what the school should have? Then you do some exploring and experimenting and visit some schools and find out which one matches your list. I think finding the right school, word of mouth too, just asking for referrals. And depending on where you are from, I'm not sure if the person asking is local to the Cleveland area or not. I know in the Cleveland area, there's a wonderful organization called Milestones that has a list of all the different schools in the area. And you're from Illinois. So I'm not sure what resources are available nearby for you, but you can also check on, maybe ask if you have a pediatrician or psychologist that you work with to refer you to a variety of schools. But then do some exploring, like an interview process, interview the different schools. Finding the school that's right for you is often much easier than getting to that school. And that's a whole nother story. But there are usually in most states, they have parent advocates who can help you with that process as well. And are we going to post the links? They are embedded in the slides, so those will be posted as well as soon as the slides are up. Any other questions? Thank you so much for attending today.